Welcome back to Your Anxious Child, 5-minute solutions and interviews with experts. Today, we are talking with Elizabeth Preston, who has just written her first book, The Creature's Guide to Caring, how animal parents teach us that humans were born to care. So, by way of explanation for a podcast entitled Your Anxious Child, what gives with this? This is a little off topic. And I would say no. Um, when we take a step back and look at the broader context, we know that mental health issues show up when we ignore our biology. And as a kind of reminder about our biology and help, clarify it, Elizabeth Preston's new book will be of tremendous help in providing a broader context. I should also say that this is a topic of personal interest for myself because before becoming a clinical psychologist, I studied mother-infant interaction in non-human primates, in particular the bonnet and pigtail macaque, doing observational studies in Brooklyn, which is actually its own kind of jungle. And we had in the laboratory a pigtail mom who rejected her baby at birth. And we couldn't get anyone to adopt it. So I agreed to become its foster parent. And it lived with me for 4 to 5 months. And I learned a lot about caretaking, as a result. This is the time when John Bowlby was just finishing his 3-volume work on attachment, and Margaret Mahler had written a book, The Psychological Birth of the Infant. So attachment was kind of all in the air at that time. And Walk, as I called her, because of the sound that she made when I gave her blueberries, was clearly very attached to me. She was with me all the time. If I was going to raise a monkey, I was going to kind of do it as best I could in my best monkey imitation. And my tennis game really suffered because if I'd be on the court playing tennis, he would see me and race over and grab hold of my ankle and hold on for dear life. But one of the things that really kind of struck me about raising this monkey was that once she knew that I was there and stable, he wanted to explore. And much as I was delighted to have her clinging onto my arm all the time, if she was filled up and felt secure, he really wanted to explore, and off she would go. And that drive to explore was just as powerful as the wish for security and attachment. And that kind of really, stood with me. We did return her to the laboratory. She did grow up in the laboratory in a group of animals. It was heartrending whenever I'd go into the lab and she'd hear me because she'd call out in her plaintive call of a separated monkey going, hoo, 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 which, okay, it broke my heart. But she did make an adjustment back into the lab. But that was, and it pains me to say this, 56 years ago. So fortunately, we've got somebody who can give us more up-to-date account of caretaking in animals with Elizabeth Preston. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to write this book.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me, even though this is not a book about how to care for an anxious child. I can't. I wish I could say more about that. Maybe you can tell me. But no, I'm a science journalist. I'm a freelance science journalist, and I write about lots of different things, but most often I write about animals. I like to write about biology, especially evolutionary biology and animal behavior, and also psychology too, and neuroscience and other kinds of biology. And when I became a parent, I noticed that while there is a whole world of parenting literature out there. It's largely focused on psychology, and it's largely prescriptive, which I think people are seeking when they become parents. They want to know, help, what can I do, right? But I wasn't really seeing anything in the world of parenting literature that approached parenting from a broader lens that said, what do we have in common with other species that care for their young? Because we are animals, and we are not the only animals that care for their young by a long shot. So I wanted to know what we would learn if we looked at parenting in the context of all the other animals on Earth that care for their young, and also their evolutionary biology, which is the story of how we got to the present day and how all these other animals got to the present day as well, and why we look different and why we look in some ways the same.
So, the roughly, I don't know, 68, 70 plus animals that you talk about, they all are, just compelling by themselves, and compelling descriptions of caretaking. But there's also a unifying kind of um, framework that kind of ties them together, that makes them not just a kind of a series of kind of just, you know, um, cute stories, but kind of a deeper meaning behind them, or a deeper thread. And I wonder if you could just help orient us to that kind of just unifying kind of perspective that can help us, um, you know, see why we really, look at these animals and see how animals can really teach us about caring. And
Yeah, so I wanted to look at all these animals both for their own sake because they are fascinating, and I do think it's worthwhile to have a greater appreciation for the variety of life out there in the world. It brings, a sense of awe and a sense of, I think, togetherness and company in the world. We're not the only species that faces these challenges with raising our young, and there's so many other incredible kinds of life out there doing their own fascinating things and living their own lives. So I do think that's valuable in and of itself. But I also wanted to, find out what all these other species could tell us about ourselves because I'm interested in myself, and most human readers, I think, want to know something about themselves, especially as parents, which is this kind of, existential questioning state. Like, what am I doing? What are we doing here? I'm trying to raise a good human, right? So my my driving question was, what are these species telling us about ourselves? And one of the most important things I learned about humans is that many scientists now think that we evolved as what's called a cooperative breeder. What this means is that there wasn't a nuclear family in our evolutionary past. There wasn't this idea that a family was this isolated unit with a mom and a dad and kids, and they had to be self-sufficient. It was more likely a more flexible and larger family setting. So we can see this when we look at traditional societies around the world today. We can also see it when we look at certain other kinds of animals that seem to have evolved along the same path and are now also cooperative breeders. So they take care of their young in these larger groups that might include other relatives, such as older kids taking care of younger kids, aunts and uncles, grandparents. They might also include unrelated animals or humans, such as just neighbors, friends, community members. And so, in the course of the book, I explore this idea a lot of what it means for our present day psychology, biology, community that we evolved with this cooperative history, and also what the other animals who are cooperative today can tell us about ourselves.
what is one of the things that's striking, and I think you maybe laid this out, you know, most clearly in actually your last chapter, is that this issue of kind of cooperative kind of care, you can see it in fish and birds and reptiles and other mammals. And could you give some examples about that? It's kind of quite striking that, I mean, you know, fish aren't exactly our first cousin, for example.
No, they're pretty far. They're about as far as you can get among the other animals that have a backbone. So there's kind of two kinds of evolutionary scenarios that I looked at in this book. One is what things are ancient and have kind of come along through the whole evolutionary family tree with us. So those are things like certain parts of the brain that are involved in caretaking that we can trace back to, say, frogs, or hormones that we use for caring for our kids that are also present in, for example, fish. Okay, so these are really ancient things. But I also looked at, like you said, examples of what's called convergent evolution. So this is when evolution kind of has the same idea, if you will, more than once. So we're evolving along these parallel paths, but we come to a similar place. And so anytime that happens, it makes me think this must be a really useful solution for surviving as a species because it's happened many times that we've come across this idea of cooperating to raise young. So it's not something that's ancient and that we were stuck with forever, like those hormones or brain areas. It's something that independently came up many, many times. So in the mammals, they're humans, but we evolved cooperative caretaking probably separately from our closest primate relatives who also do it, which are kind of distantly related monkeys in South America. Our closest primate relatives, the other great apes, do not cooperate to raise young. In fact, they have a very different looking system where the moms are responsible for basically all the caretaking. And then this cooperation has also arisen, like you said, in kinds of fish. It's arisen in reptiles. It's arisen in birds. And so this happening over and over again tells you there's something really beneficial to the species that have stumbled across this way of life.
I want to go back to one thing you just mentioned was that we can really kind of see the similarity in terms of parental kind of the hormones that come into play and certain parts of the kind of brain that seem to be kind of really kind of central. The you mentioned the medial preoptic nucleus. So I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that because it's pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You know, some of your descriptions of like the stickleback fish having
Mhm.
similar endocrine, hormonal changes to people. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, like,
Yeah. Right. It's surprising. So one of my favorite examples is the hormone called prolactin, which was named because we discovered that it makes milk. So prolactin in humans, it's involved in milk letdown, among other things. But it evolved in fish, which don't have milk, obviously. And in the caretaking parent that mostly uses prolactin in fish is the dad. When you look at the fishes, most kind of fish don't care for their young. They just lay some eggs, the eggs hatch, the parents are long gone. But there is a minority of fish species that do care for their young, and among those species, it's almost always the dad. And so this is really fascinating to think about as a mammal, because we have this bias where we kind of see the mother as the primal, ancient parent, but it's really not true when you look across the whole animal kingdom, these fish dads were probably the first caring vertebrate parents on Earth.
tell us about the finback midshipman, which
The Plainman
the
midshipman
plaintiff.
is quite a character. I love him. So, yeah, this is a really interesting fish. It lives most of the time in the deep ocean. And then in the spring, in their breeding season, the males travel to shore and they come almost all the way onto the land and they dig a nest. They burrow under a rock. They kind of scoop out a space. They defend this nest and they start to use they make this really loud droning sound. They use their swim bladder, which is an organ fish have to help them stay the right depth in the water, but they've adapted it to make a very loud, buzzing, humming, droning noise. And there was a funny story in the book where in the 1980s, there was this houseboat community off the coast of California, and they started hearing this very loud noise at night. And there were all these theories about what it might be. They thought it was maybe Soviet submarines doing secret exercises, but it was these fish. And so they make this terrifically loud noise. It attracts the females, and the females come from the deep sea, and they follow this irresistible droning sound, and they choose a male from his beautiful song and his nest, and the female will lay her eggs underneath the rock that's covering the male's nest, and the female leaves. That's her entire involvement in the young. She doesn't do anything except lay some eggs. and choose the right dad. Then after she leaves, the dad has to stay there, and he has this very intense job. He stays for months. He has to defend this nest because other males who haven't yet found the nest will come and they'll try to fight each other. They have these big wide mouths and they kind of chomp each other's faces. And he's also in a lot of danger because he's so close to the shore. Often, when the tide goes out, his nest will be completely dry. He has to just hunker down in his little puddle, hope for the best, hope that the tide comes back in before he dries out. There are all kinds of seabirds who would love to eat him while he's sitting there under his rock on the shore. And also, he doesn't eat anything for months while he's there in this nest. He just slowly starves and completely dedicates himself to defending these eggs until they hatch, and then he can flee back to the deep ocean and to safety, assuming he's made it that far.
Wow. Wow. Um, the the scientists that you talk to are cautious about making kind of one-to-one kind of correspondence or saying this is an analog of
Mhm.
this particular, understandably so. Um, and one of the kind of interesting things that you kind of elucidate um, is what could be the beginning signs, or how do we kind of build cooperative kind of parenting? And you use examples of like paper wasps,
Mm.
for that, and and talk about the centrality of kind of eating as kind of being a foundation for cooperation, which I think is kind of a really kind of interesting perspective. And I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more about how looking at kind of insects can give us kind of an idea about how um, cooperative parenting could actually emerge, or and the like.
Yeah, yeah. So the insects, of course, are about as far away from a human as you can get, on the tree of life. So when we're looking at them, we're not saying this is something we share in our literal DNA. We're saying maybe we have walked along the same path through evolutionary time. And insects, because they have such short lifespans, you can watch these generations that take, decades in humans pass so quickly. You can really see a whole story play out. And so I use the example of a paper wasp. The paper wasp is social, but not quite as social as something like a honeybee. So the honeybee is what's called eusocial. It lives in a big hive with a queen and these sterile workers who don't have any babies. They have this division of labor and they're highly, highly cooperative. They all kind of function as a superorganism. The paper wasp is kind of maybe a step below that. I don't want to rank them, but it's not quite the same thing. Um, but what happens in the paper wasp is it starts with a single mother, a single fertilized female who has mated with some males. Then she hunkers down over the winter. And then in the spring, she lays some eggs. She builds a tiny little nest, just a few cells. She lays her eggs. They're all going to be daughters because of the genetic weirdness of the ants, bees, and wasps. She's able to control whether she's having daughters or uh, sons. So she lays these daughter eggs, and once they hatch, if everyone survives, these daughters begin to help their mother. So she transitions from a period of intense solo parenting to a cooperative lifestyle. Now she continues to lay eggs, she continues to make more babies, but her daughters are doing all the work of building out the nest. They're helping to care for, feed the new young. And so this family grows and grows, and it becomes something more like the honeybee, where you see this hive, they're working together. It's this whole cooperative community. And it starts with just that single parent and her children. So the reason I talk about this in the book is because this might illustrate how cooperative caretaking and these communities have evolved in other places in the tree of life. You can start with a species where you have a mother who just does all the caretaking. And then if you have some sort of transition where her children start to, instead of immediately leaving home when they grow up, starting their own lives, their own families, if they stay home for some period and they help care for their younger brothers and sisters, you start to have this larger cooperative family. And from there, you can build and build. And so we see different examples in the book of animals that have different degrees of this cooperation, including humans. So, probably in our evolutionary past, we had a similar story where we started out as a mammal like our great ape cousins, where the mothers did all the work. But at some point, for some reason, our children started to stay home with their moms and not just leave. Also, our partners started to stay around. We have pair bonding, which is something you don't see again in the other great apes. And so these ingredients together led to this new kind of, well, new for the apes. It led to this unique human system. We have pair bonding, we have cooperative families, and then we also have these unusual, huge empathetic brains. And we have these unusually slow growing, highly needy babies that need a lot of care. So they need more than just a mother can provide. And so we brought in these other helpers to help raise them. So all these ingredients together led to Homo sapiens today. But because it started with that simple mother and child, we can see the parallel to what happens every time a wasp community is born.
Right. Yeah, as I was reading your book, I was just sort of thinking, what, the marmoset, compared to, we have in many ways more similarity to a bloody marmoset compared to, an orangutan or, gorilla or chimp. But in a way we do. It's,
Definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, the marmosets and the tamarins in South America are these small treetop monkeys, and they also have this cooperative lifestyle where the mother almost always gives birth to twins. It's much too much for her to handle on her own up there juggling the twins in the tree branches. And so she relies on help from her previous children, from her partner. They all work together, and it's really critical to have that family to care for the young. And this is really the closest parallel to our social system, even though, like you said, we're really not closely related among the primates.
right. So um I'm interested in um how you think about these issues when you turn your gaze onto the kind of tree of life and animal kind of kingdom. And um in one of your chapters, the one of you aren't what you do, you aren't who you are, but what you do.
Hmm.
Okay, you start off the chapter with a detailed discussion of poison frogs,
Hmm.
and then you end up the chapter with dads talking to their babies and stuff like that. So wait a minute, how do we get from point A to point B over here? I mean, um, this is not necessarily a straight shoot, but you make it one. So help me out.
Yes, yes. This chapter of my book is called What You Do, Not Who You Are. And the idea I wanted to explore there was flexibility, flexibility in gender roles, and in some species, flexibility in the sex of the animal itself. I talk about some kinds of fish that can change sex in the middle of their life, and that's important to their family structure. But the reason I was able to connect the frogs with ultimately the humans as well as other animals is this flexibility. So the poison frogs are a really fun species, or a really fun group of species to study when you're looking at parental care, because the poison frogs need parenting because they have this life stage where they lay their eggs in the rainforest. When their eggs hatch, they are tadpoles, which need to be in water, but because their parents have laid them, in the leaf litter, they're out in the air. So someone urgently needs to carry these tadpoles to water. So the poison frogs have evolved different systems depending on the species, but it's more often the dad who has this job. And so the dad will put the tadpoles on his back and he piggybacks them until he finds the perfect pool of water for them. This might be all his babies going into one pool, or depending on the species, sometimes the tadpoles are cannibals. So if you put more than one on your back, they're liable to eat each other on your way to where you're going. So he has to carry them one at a time, very painstakingly, and find separate little pools. And then again, depending on the species, maybe he keeps track of where those pools are and he comes back to check on them and see if they're hungry. There's some species where if he finds that his tadpoles are hungry, he will sing to his mate, and then she will come over and she will lay unfertilized eggs into their pools for these babies to eat. So they really do a lot of care. But one thing that scientists have looked at is this division of labor. So, it is often, like I said, the dad who carries the eggs. But what happens if the dad disappears? Because, life is tough in the rainforest for a little bite-sized amphibian. So, sometimes things go wrong. And so researchers have found in some of these species that there is a flexibility that, let's say, if the dad is doing this carrying, the mom is also aware. She's listening for the sound of her mate's voice. She might have multiple partners and multiple batches of kids around the rainforest. But if she notices that one of those voices belonging to her mate goes missing, maybe he had a bad day and he got eaten by a snake, she is ready to take over his role. She will carry those tadpoles when those eggs hatch that belong to that partner. And then scientists have looked in the brains of the frogs who were doing this work, and they can see where that activation happens in the brain. They can see that caretaking brain switch on. And the area that they've found to be really important is this part of the hypothalamus called the MPOA, the medial preoptic area. And it has come up again and again across different species, including other mammals, as a region that's really critical for caring. And so the reason I talked about it in the frogs and then linked it to humans is because they use this area to be able to switch into a new role when necessary, that all of them have this region, they have this equipment in their brain for caretaking, and it can turn on when their external cues tell them it's necessary. So in humans, I talk about how uh, humans also, of course, are extremely flexible as a species in many ways. And one of the ways that we're flexible is in these gender roles or these sex roles that even if our culture tells us it should be a certain way, of course, we are infinitely flexible, and fathers can do almost all the things that mothers can do, and other family members or adoptive caretakers or friends can also fill the same roles.
But isn't that research that you kind of cite about how similar brain changes can occur with fathers, but they seem to acquire it not obviously through the physiology of pregnancy, but through experience.
Mhm.
Um, and they can kind of experience the same kind of changes. But
Right.
it's one, yeah. Go
Yeah, so
ahead.
I talked about some really interesting classic research that took place in Israel about the brains of mothers and fathers in heterosexual couples, and also fathers who were adoptive parents. And they found that there was a very similar network of regions in the brain that were activated during parenting. There wasn't a distinct mom brain versus dad brain. And the way that those networks were weighted was a little bit different, but what it suggested overall was that there's kind of two routes to becoming a caring parent. And there's been other research that also supports this idea. You can either switch on that caring circuitry by being pregnant and birthing a baby and having all of the hormonal things happening in your body and brain that tell you, okay, a baby is coming, it's time to care. Or you can switch it on from the outside in instead of the inside out. And so if you're the father or another caretaker, those cues of being around a baby or someone who needs care can turn on the same caretaking equipment. And because we all have this equipment, this makes sense if you think about a history as cooperative caretakers, because anybody kind of sitting around the campfire would have been on call to care.
Mhm.
So we all need to have the ability for that caring architecture to be turned on and activated because it might be our turn, even if we haven't birthed the baby or, been living with the baby for a long time. It might become our turn. So there needs to be a way to switch on that mode.
Yeah, no, I was always kind of struck when my children were little, and I was pretty actively involved that about when they would cry at night. I actually kind of felt like somebody was taking a piece of glass and kind of scraping it against my heart. Yeah, we just couldn't get there fast enough.
Hmm.
Um, you know, it so I really kind of felt the physiological kind of changes that come
Yeah.
with that. It's quite striking.
Yeah.
The one of the I wonder if you would be willing just to kind of talk about oxytocin,
Mm.
in terms of the different ways it kind of shows up, and um, about prairie voles, and how there's been some very interesting kind of research about oxytocin in rats and or mice and caretaking, um, and obviously pertains to humans as well.
Yeah, oxytocin shows up all over the place in research whenever people look at especially bonding. So, it's been nicknamed the love hormone, but it has a lot of roles and it's especially involved in bonding. And so the prairie voles are the animal where the importance of oxytocin really came to light. The prairie voles are these very social mammals. They live in these little cooperative families in the wild. And also in the lab, you can see how they care for each other and they care for unrelated babies. They do this, what's called allo-parenting for other parenting. That's when you have a cooperative caretaker who's not the parent. So the prairie voles are great alloparents, especially the young male prairie voles for some reason. If they see a pup, they will run to it and they will put their body on top of it and kind of cuddle to keep it warm. They love to do this. So, research in the prairie voles started to reveal the importance of oxytocin because they have a lot of receptors in their brains for oxytocin and more compared to their closest relatives who are not as social. And so this revealed, that oxytocin is important. And the prairie voles, especially, are monogamous. Now they have a very short life. And so in the wild, some of your partner might again get eaten. And so you might have to find a new partner. But as long as that partner has not been eaten, they stick together with their partner and they're tightly bonded. And so this oxytocin seems to be really important for this pair bonding. And scientists have suggested that pair bonding actually came about because of the mother-baby bond. And so that oxytocin, which also is involved in a mother and baby bonding to each other, once a mammal's brain had this equipment in place, it was able to be just tweaked so that instead of bonding to a baby, you could bond to a partner. And in both cases, oxytocin allows you to link this particular cue, in this case, a person or a prairie vole, your preferred partner or your child, to your brain's reward system, where the dopamine is involved. And so being with this person, this baby, or your partner is rewarding and feels really good. But there was some really interesting research in the prairie voles a few years ago where they engineered them to have absolutely no receptors for oxytocin. So they made their bodies unable to hear the signals of oxytocin. And they thought that they would not be able to bond with partners. They wanted to see what would happen. And they grew these prairie voles in the lab and they were totally normal. So it was this big mystery and they have not, I'm sure they're working on it, but they haven't, I don't think, published anything else yet explaining why this might have happened. But somehow, even though oxytocin is so central to this bonding between partners, when they took it away, biology was still able to compensate for that somehow and create the same system of bonding and companionship.
Wow. The one of the things you talk about in the book is how the potential effect, there's the effect of the parents on the infants, but it also goes the other way. The infant has an effect on the caregiver.
Mhm.
And there's a compelling example you gave about male prairie voles recovering from surgery.
Hmm. Yeah, I talked with one researcher who studies prairie voles in the lab, and he was doing an experiment. I don't remember what the original point of the experiment was, but part of it involved a surgery on some male prairie voles. He was preparing to be able to take some measurement in them, so he had to perform this surgery. And he happened to notice that as these male prairie voles were recovering from their surgery in the lab, they were seeking out pups. They were finding pups and cuddling with them, and it seemed like the cuddling was making them feel better. So then he said, I'm going to study that instead and find out what's going on there. And he found that it did make them feel better, but weirdly, their heart rate would go up when they were cuddling the pups. So this was confusing. It was like, is it calming them down and comforting them, or is it stressing them out somehow? And he figured out what seemed to be happening is they seek out these pups to cuddle because it makes them feel good, but also when they cuddle the pups, they increase their heart rate to raise their body temperature and help warm up the pup. So they're always caring and you can't stop them. He said he used to study this prairie vole alloparenting in the lab and he stopped and it was ultimately very difficult to do the research because he said you want to compare, what makes them care more or less for these unrelated pups. But he could never get them to care less. They always just, these young males who wanted to care for the pups, they always just did the most all the time. He even tried to annoy them by like piping in the sound of crying prairie vole pups, and it didn't bother them at all. They just wanted to cuddle them.
That story reminded me of the famous pediatrician Barry Brazelton,
Hmm.
who was the ultimate infant whisperer um, about all things infancy. And he was visiting in, I believe, Bosnia, in the kind of the war-torn, area, and had a guide. And the day had been pretty depressing, and it's, as you might expect. And he said to his guide afterwards, "Let's go find some babies."
Hmm.
Um, and it also reminded me, in a slightly different way, of kind of a recommendation, believe it or not, in something quite a field, of Tom Bunn, who's big in the field of fear of flying.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he kind of recommends to people who are anxious about kind of flying is they develop a photo album of things that they can kind of look at that can kind of perhaps soothe them. And top of the list is, if you're a mom, is a picture of you nursing your baby
Mm.
as being one of the more helpful things that you can kind of show. And
Yeah.
likewise, in kind of in the work I do with children who are needlephobic, often some of the best videos that they can kind of watch as a distraction are the otter and babies on their backs swimming in the river, or or some other cute kind of baby videos and stuff like
Mhm.
that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you think of our history as cooperative caretakers, that system doesn't work if it has to rely on just the goodness of people's hearts. It doesn't work if you have to rely on the allo parents to be altruistic. It works if we want to care for babies, like if we're attracted to babies and it feels rewarding to just pick up a baby and sniff it and see its little face and squish its little cheeks. So babies have to be appealing and we have to be attracted to babies. So it's all, it's kind of unsentimental to say so, but it's all biological that we find babies so pleasant and appealing. Um, and that evolution, it applies to the babies also. Like as we evolved to become more cooperative in our ancient history, I wrote about how our babies would have also been evolving to be more appealing, right? Because they need to appeal to these other caretakers. Someone else has to say, "Oh, I'll hold that baby for you. You go get your food." And one part of this might be babbling. So I wrote about how the only other primates that are known to babble are these marmosets and tamarins, which have this cooperative care. So babbling, while it seems intuitive that it has something to do with language, maybe it also has to do with just charming an adult caretaker and saying, "Hey, come engage with me, pick me up, take care of me, carry me around."
And interestingly, you point out that it doesn't occur in chimpanzees or, as best we can determine, orangutans.
Right. The other grade 8 babies, I believe, were all quite quiet, which makes sense again when you think about this history, because if you look at something like a gorilla infant, it spends 100% of its time physically on its mother's body, right? It clings to her fur, she nurses it whenever it wants. So it never needs to say anything because there's nothing it has to communicate uh, verbally. But if you look at a human baby, which might have been passed around to different caretakers, it needs a way to say, "Hey, I'm hungry. Someone send me back to my mom." Or like, "Hey, my sister put me down in a pile of leaves and I'm getting cold and I need someone to pick me up." So it makes sense that our babies are noisy and cry and yell because they needed to get attention if they were not guaranteed to be always with their moms.
So, I'm curious for people who are, wanting to kind of learn more about this. They obviously should read your book. Um, and and by the way, they'll have fun doing that as well. Um, are there um, are there movies or videos that you particularly kind of like that illustrate what you were talking about? Uh,
I
think
mean,
about
once you start, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking of Meerkat Motel or something, or
Oh,
Manor.
Meerkat Manor. Yeah, actually, Meerkat Manor, I ended up cutting meerkats from the book because I did some interviews, but then they were a little too similar to the banded mongooses that I highlighted. They're
Mhm.
they're related. It's a similar species, but there's a scientist who has been studying them for decades, the meerkats, and his research site is where they did the show Meerkat Manor, and he, advised on the show. So it is scientifically grounded. But I was going to say that once you start, thinking about biology and caretaking through this lens, you will see it kind of all over the place in things that you watch. I was recently visiting my sister in Berkeley for a book event I was doing there, and we came back from my event and watched a nature show that she put on. I think it was just, PBS Nature, and it was focusing on an animal sanctuary called Reteti. I'm not sure even what country they were in. It started in the middle. I was like, I don't know if I want to watch this. I'm sick of talking about animals. But it actually became really interesting because I could see how these human caretakers were so attached to these baby elephants and also other animals like baby ostriches that they were caring for. And I was thinking of them as alloparents, and we humans have this caring machinery in our brains. There's nothing that says we can only direct it toward human babies. And I think that when you see, people caring for their pets or even caring for their gardens and the land, it seems to me like that is probably an expression of that same impulse that we have become so good at caring and looking for places that need our care and directing that care that, it kind of pours out of us all the time and we're able to really love, an elephant.
Would would it be a stretch to suggest that there's a wider significance to your book in the sense that, you know, the pace of change has increased kind of dramatically, and in a way we've become, in many ways, divorced from nature or separated more, and that we really need help kind of getting reconnected to nature if we're going to deal with a climate crisis. And in particular, not to look at other animals as, others, or there's us versus them, but that really kind of we're part of it if we're going to kind of, wrestle with this climate crisis. Is that a stretch or not where you want to go?
No, I mean, I hope that there's a larger significance here. I feel a larger
Yeah,
significance
there is.
because, I really argued in the book that, like we said at the beginning, this history of cooperative caretaking has really become for humans the basis of our whole society because you can argue that because we were living in these cooperative groups and we had to become more and more empathetic and attuned to each other for the sake of raising our babies together, we develop these bigger and bigger, more and more cooperative, empathetic brains that aren't really like the other great apes, the other primates. We're really our own kind of animal at this point. And because we also have language and thumbs and everything else, we've evolved along this unique path. And now we've kind of taken over the whole world. And so I argue that that caring is really at the root of everything we've become. And I think it's an optimistic message because, when you look around, you can see, okay, it doesn't matter if people have their own kids or not. We all have this legacy of being cooperative caretakers. And so we all have that capacity to cooperate and to care for each other, whether or not we're directing it toward babies or our own families. And it's at the basis of our society. And I think it can be at the basis of how we move forward from this moment. And another thing I wrote about is in some research, scientists have looked at where cooperative caretaking has evolved across large groups of animals, so like across many species of birds or many species of mammals. And they've found this pattern where species that are evolving in more challenging environments, maybe there's not a lot of rain, or maybe the rain is very unpredictable, it's hard to survive, those species are more likely to be cooperative caretakers. So it seems in a really challenging, unpredictable climate, there's an advantage to this cooperation. And that even showed up in a study of humans, that traditional human groups living in these more difficult environments were more cooperative in how they raised their kids. And so, it's tempting to extend that and say if we're going to survive in our ever more challenging climate that is planet Earth, because we have made it a challenge right now, we're going to have to come together and tap into that history of cooperation.
Well, it's just about time for us to stop. One final question. A standard question that a child psychologist would ask a 7 or 8 or maybe a 9-year-old child when they came in is, if you could be any animal you wanted for an afternoon, what would you like to be? And what kind of animal would you never want to be?
Well,
Yeah. And I wonder if you, in the course of your research, have developed a favorite.
mm, it's hard because there's just so many. It's like naming a favorite child. I can tell you some animals I would never want to be because
Yeah.
I did read about some that get eaten by their children. And I'm not eager for that experience. So there are some spider mothers who get eaten by their hatchlings. There's an amphibian mother called a Sicilian who does not get killed by her babies, but they do peel off pieces of her skin to eat, which is pretty upsetting. So I don't want to be most of those species. I think one animal that I thought seemed like a pretty cool lifestyle that they figured out is a bird called the greater Ani, which is a cooperative breeder, but instead of living in an extended family group like most of these cooperative species, it lives with groups of its friends. So they live in these groups that are 2 or 3 bird couples. They're unrelated, but they come together year after year with their same little buddy group. And they all lay their eggs into the same nest. And when the eggs hatch, they all feed them together. They care for them together. They don't keep track of whose chicks are whose. And they're totally reliant on this group. They will not lay eggs or raise young as just a single couple. They need to have that group of buddies to make it work.
They sound kind of delightful.
Yeah.
Um, well, Elizabeth, where can people find out more about you and where you might be appearing in future events and things like that?
Yes, I have a website, which is elizabethgpreston.com. You can see all my book events and other information there. I also have a Substack, which is called Inkfish, and I'm on Blue Sky, also at Inkfish.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And your book is delightful.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.